Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our Bible study through the book of Psalms. We have a ton to cover today. We're talking about Psalm 73. If you want the outline, you can download it on our website for free at tobelikechrist.com. Our second page is so full, we better get right into it. Otherwise, we're going to be way over 5 minutes. So, Psalm 73, the author is a guy named Asaph. We find that out right at the beginning of the psalm. We don't have any New Testament references today. We do have some very interesting themes, however. Number one, questioning why God allows the evil to flourish, or seemingly to flourish, while the righteous often suffer. And then number two, in seeking God, we will find stability amongst life's confusion. Our definition's just one. I don't think we've seen this one yet. Verse 4, pangs of death. The word pang is similar in meaning to the word pain, but it generally denotes a more intense feeling. It's a severe or often a sudden pain. As we open up Psalm 73, we see our psalmist struggling a little bit. Verses 1 through 14, the temptation to live like the wicked. So Asaph documented how he was tempted to live like the wicked men that he saw around him. He said that he was very close to slipping off the edge into their immorality because on the surface, their lives seemed to be very enviable. He says in verse 3, quote, "For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." So these immoral men were well fed, they were fat on abundance, doing pretty well by earthly material standards. They didn't struggle through life on a daily basis like a lot of other men, poorer men. They lived without pain all the way up until their death. Their lives seemed very comfortable. He says that they wore pride as a necklace, violence as their clothing, and their hearts overflowed with sin. But the consequences of their actions never really seemed to catch up with them, at least as far as Asaph could see. Their evil was just on display for everybody to see, and it caused righteous people to question God, asking, why would God allow the world to be this way? Why do these wicked people flourish? Everyone knows they're evil. Everyone can see the terrible things they do. Why does God allow this to continue? So while the righteous suffered, the wicked were, quote, always at ease and increasing in wealth. The righteous people of Asaph's day meditated on this dilemma, and they were trying to figure out how it could be explained that an all-knowing God allowed this to continue. Asaph was tempted to believe that all of his efforts, all of his trouble to try to live a holy and an upright and a righteous life was just a complete waste of time. He says in verse 13 and 14, "All in vain have I kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence, for all the day long I have been stricken and rebuked every morning." So this is the dilemma that's before us, and I imagine there's many who have asked this question in our day, probably many who are watching this study. Let's talk about a visit to the sanctuary that gives clarity to Asaph in the second part of our chapter, verses 15 through 28. Asaph was tempted to throw in the towel and to join the evildoers. But when the time came, the decisive moment was there, and he had to make a decision. He was wise enough to stay on God's side. He said that to join the wicked would be to betray God's people and essentially to lie to them, to lead them astray. Now, trying to reconcile the flourishing of the wicked was difficult for Asaph. It was difficult at least until he went into the sanctuary of God, the text says, and he remembered God's words. There was no future for the wicked. If they weren't punished in this life, then God was going to deal with them and punish them after their deaths. In questioning God, Asaph had been foolish. He said that he acted, quote, brutish and ignorant. But after visiting the sanctuary, he asked God to take his hand and to guide him. His faith in God was restored. He was reminded of who he was, who God is, and how God's going to take care of everything. God would guide him through life and receive him to glory after death in verse 24, which I think is a good verse to maybe make a note of, speaking about the resurrection in the Old Testament. We had talked about that a little bit and the debate around that in a previous psalm. Asaph writes this as he closes out the psalm, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is nothing on earth that I desire beside you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." So he has this struggle at the beginning of the chapter, these questions that he can't answer, but in reminding himself of the foundational knowledge of who God is and how God is just and how he's fair, Asaph understands that being on the side of the wicked, that's not going to get him anywhere in the end. Being on God's side, that's the life that has a future. So now that brings us to our application for today. The world that Asaph observed stirred up all kinds of emotions inside of him. One of the biggest emotions was confusion. He was confused about why the world was the way that it was. While he was in his own head and in his own thoughts, he almost took a devastating step off of a cliff and went to, live like the wicked people. He was so confused that he wanted to reject God and embrace the lifestyle of godless people. But when he went into the sanctuary and reminded himself of God's words, he stepped back from the cliff. His mind was put at ease as the words of his Creator made sense of the world. The stability of the eternal God steadied him and allowed him to proceed logically instead of emotionally and irrationally. This is why personal biblical literacy, and what we're trying to do in these studies, and teaching the words of God to others is so important. Because the world is a confusing place. And that isn't helped by the fact that we have an adversary who's intentionally trying to confuse us and to lie to us all the time to get us to turn our back on God. Without the stabilizing truth of God's word, we're liable to eat up the devil's lies and to walk off any number of cliffs. Our societies are filled with so many people who are completely confused about who they are, about why they are here, and the meaning of life, and why the world is the way that it is. They are walking off cliffs, and the only thing that will save them is the truth that flows out of the sanctuary of God. So there you have it. That is Psalm 73 and our application for today. Now, I'm making this video right up against Labor Day weekend as a holiday weekend, and I don't usually do this, but I'm going to take the weekend off. And so we will be back, I believe, September the 3rd, which is Tuesday, to study Psalm 74 together. So I hope you have a fantastic weekend.